Hello, I'm Professor Matthew Rotella, and in this tutorial, I'm looking to answer the question for you of what are UVs, and to some extent, how do we work with them? Well, what UVs are their coordinates that are used to map two-dimensional textures onto 3D objects. So you have a 3D object, which I'll just be using a cube for this demo to get the simplest thing possible for you to wrap your head around. And so we have a 3D object, and we want to put images, our textures, which are in the form of images, onto said object, the cube. Now, so to do that, we need to get our cube represented as a 2D image and use that to map our 2D texture onto our 3D object. Now, to make that more clear, I'll just bring up the UV editor. So this is my UV editor here, and it has the UVs for my cube displayed. Now, U and V correspond to the axes on which the coordinates exist. So you got U in the place of the x-axis and V in the place of the y-axis. So, and you can see here, if I click on different faces, each face corresponds to a different face in my UV editor. So basically, what happens when you create UVs is you want to get a 3D object and unfold it into a flat 2D representation of that object so that you can map flat 2D images onto your 3D object. So to do that, I have this cube that I have effectively torn apart for the purpose of demonstrating how everything gets unfolded. So basically, when you unfold this cube into this shape, which you're going to have to give me a hot second here, because I have edges occupying the same world space. But yeah, so basically what happens is the edge comes out and everything gets unfolded, and then just gonna bring this down, and it all gets unfolded like so, so that you get the resulting shape of the UVs. Now, 2 seconds. Set my pivot. Boop. 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 These get unfolded like that. And then these two sides get unfolded like so. One, and then down. So we have our cube that gets unfolded into this shape in our UV space, so that we get this shape here. Now, hopefully that drives that whole concept home rather well of how UVs get unfolded so that we can map an image onto them. Now, I have this image, which you likely spotted already, of the 6 sides of a die that then get mapped onto the cube. So, if we go back into Maya, I look at my cube, and I'm going to make a new texture for my cube. I already made one, but I'll make it again. So this is my hypershade, which there's a little shortcut. That's this little ball right here. It's also under Windows, Rendering Editors, and Hypershade. And since I'm rendering in Arnold, I'll make an AI standard surface shader, as opposed to something more generic like a Blinn or a Lambert or some such. I won't be doing any rendering in this tutorial, but I like to just be consistent with whatever rendering engine I'm using. And I'll go into Color, hit this little checkerboard here, I'll hit File, and then I'll hit my folder, which your image should likely be stored in the source images of your project folder, which shouldn't look like a mess like this, but regardless. And so now I have a surface shader with a texture file on it, and then I can go into object mode, select my object, and assign my material to the selection. And by default, you won't see anything on there, but you can either hit this little ball here, which will give you your hardware texturing, or you can go under shading and then hardware texturing, and that turns the same thing on and off. Okay, so I got my UV editor with my UVs in it, which again correspond to the different faces that you can see. The 4 is in my is lined up here in my image, and the 3 and the 1 and the 5 and so on. Now, if you want to get this out of here so that you can properly line up your all of your textures in a separate program, what you want to do is you want to select your UVs and go into Image and then UV Snapshot. Then you want to designate your image format, whether that be PNG or JPEG or what have you. I tend to lean towards PNGs, and then let's do it regular HD square, and I'll just have it go into my source images folder, and if I say cube UVs, I'll hit save, which I haven't saved it yet, but then I'll hit apply and close, and you can see down here in my output that I have output the image. And then if I were to go and do something like Photoshop, you can see how this can be used. But in the meantime, while Photoshop is opening, I'll go over some of the fundamentals of moving things around within the UV editor. So, first of all, I should likely point out that you can cut and sew different UV edges together so that you can either detach your UV faces, or you can and move them around within your UV editor. And I should also point out that, like if I go in my UV shell selection mode, that this 1x1 UV space, so to speak, it loops and it continues to, well, it tiles to all of these other UV spaces outside of here. So if I were to scale this so that it is roughly the size of my original 1x1 UV space and then place it, you can now see that all sides of my cube have a have my entire UV map placed across each individual side. Now, as to cutting and sewing, which there are a lot of tools here in your UV toolkit, which when working, especially for the first time, I recommend just having the Maya documentation open for the UV editor overview, because this has a whole list of everything that's included in the UV toolkit, complete with helpful GIFs showing demonstrations of how various tools work, diagrams on what to do and what not to do. You should always be looking at your documentation. It's incredibly helpful, especially when you're like trying to figure out what tool might be right for the job. Look through, you say, hey, what tool does what sounds like what I want to do? And then you can read its description, try it out. Big help, especially when you're first learning all these tools. Anyway, there, you can see that there's a section called Cut and Sew. Now, if I were to grab this edge here and say cut, now I've cut that away, and now this is its own separate UV shell in here, and red snapping on. And now, arranging tiles and rearranging them in a strip is relatively simple, because you just take them from one place in the strip and put them in another straight line. I say this now because I'm going to say that you can't just like willy-nilly cut and sew any edge together, because they have to make logical sense within the UV space. Like, since these are all in the same loop of edges, I can cut and sew between certain places relatively freely, but then also understand that, like, this edge in my UV space is also this edge at the same time, because in my world space it is just this one singular edge between the 1 and the 5. And even though I've separated it into different shells and it looks like two different edges in my UV editor, they are still, of course, the same edge. So when you're arranging and rearranging your coordinates, you have to keep that sort of thing in mind. And if you want certain UVs to stay in place, there's all sorts of things you can use. Like, you can pin UVs, for example. Like, I can select these UVs and pin them in place, and now if I go to move my UVs, those UVs stay in the same spot. Alright? Yeah, and the rest all stay in the same spot, and I can unpin these UVs by, of course, just going into my pin tool and hit unpin. And if you have a whole bunch pinned and you don't want to select them, you can just hit unpin all. Alright, now I want to snap these boys together before I sew my edge together. And so what I'll do, and you can snap two shells into each other using this snap together function right here, and you can base it off of individual UVs. So I want to do this because I want to move this shell in to be right against this shell without me distorting my UVs in any way, because otherwise I'll have some odd stretching. And so what I'll do is I'll select this UV and this UV, so I went from this loose one to my bigger shell, and then in this case I want B to A, and then I'll hit snap together, and it'll just move my shell right into it. I'm going to select my edge, which these are still two separate UV shells, you see, and I can select my edge, and now I'll hit sew, and now that I've sewn them together, I can select them, and they are all one shell again. And also, in this case, my 5 has remained in the same spot because, remember, my 5 is at the top, and these UV tiles, well, tile throughout my UV editor, so I've effectively moved my shell into the same spot, but I've also moved it within the same edge loop. Point being, you can move UV shells around. Now, you can't just be crazy with it, like I said. Like, if they don't flow properly into each other within the edge flow of your model, then you're going to have a problem. Like, if I select, let's say I select the 4 there, and I hit, and I hit cut, so that I cut the 4 off, and then I select these 2 edges, so that I can cut the 2, I can effectively swap the positions of my faces on my die, and I can snap those in place later, but regardless, now if I want to, now if I were to just try and like sew these 2 edges together on my 2, so even though they're touching in my UV editor, I can't just sew them right together because they're not next to each other in world space. You can see here that with those two edges selected, that I am actually selecting this edge and this edge here on my cube, and then it's corresponding to this, and these 2 here. So if I go ahead and I press sew, and I sew these edges together, I'm going to get my UVs collapsing in weird ways because they aren't actually next to each other in world space. So in this case, I can shift my UV shells and faces around to move the faces of my die around, but when you're sewing edges together, they do have to actually exist next to each other in world space. So keep that in mind when you're going and maneuvering your UV shells. Let's see. And before I continue, I'll just get these back to where they were. I'll point out just a couple handy transformation tools. So up here under my transform menu, we got our rotate 90 degrees. You can also, if I wanted to flip these in V, you got your standard flip, and then also let's say, okay, we shall use my rotation tool. Like, let's say you have a UV shell that's cocked one way or the other. I can hit orient shells, and what it'll do is it will orient my edges on my UVs in the direction that orient my UVs in the direction that it thinks fits best. So like if it's closer to fitting vertically and I hit orient shells, it'll fit vertically. And if it's closer to fitting horizontally and I hit it, it'll orient it horizontally. And also, let's see. Here's something I want to point out also, is that you can have multiple UV shells occupying the same UV space. Now, if you're using a texture painting program, this can cause you problems, but if you have faces that you want to be identical, then overlapping your UVs in your UV space can be very useful, especially if your entire UV space is just one image, because basically the more UV space a UV face is able to occupy, the higher resolution your texture is going to look on your model. So smaller things you want to take up less UV space, and larger things you want to take up more UV space in your UV editor, so that your large objects have the most pixel density and therefore will be the least obvious. Okay. So, alright, so basically I just want to get all of these edges and cut these up. Now, get all my UV shells, and I can use my layout and say stack them. So now I have all of my shells stacked into one UV space, and with all of my shells selected, if I move them all to occupy the space of the one, then every side of my die will have a 1 on it, and it'll be effectively duplicated across my entire model. And select your shells, and if you hit layout, it'll pack them all into your UV space here, and then you can do further layouts from there and stitch and sew together as need be. But generally, I have covered what UVs are and the basics of moving them around in your UV editor. So I'm just going to call this that for now, and then in my next tutorial I'm going to start UV unwrapping a guitar that I started modeling in a different tutorial, and you can see how UV unwrapping a more complex object can go. Alright, thank you for watching, hope this was helpful, hope you learned, and thanks for watching.